On the 10th of June, 1944, Violette Szabo, French-British agent of the Special Operations Executive, was captured by German forces. She was taken to Fresnes prison in Paris and interrogated by the Gestapo at their headquarters. Later, she was moved to Ravensbrück women's concentration camp and subjected to several months of hard labour. At the end of January of 1945, alongside fellow SOE operatives Denise Bloch and Liliane Rolfe, Szabo was executed. She was 23 years old. In 1947, she would be posthumously awarded the George Cross, only the second woman to receive the award. It would be collected by her daughter, Tanya, who was just 4 years old at the time. Szabo's story is a fascinating one, even amongst the stories of the SOE and the French resistance of World War II, and in 2009, German developer Replay Studios would release Velvet Assassin, a game inspired by her story. It's very important to note quite how much heavy lifting the word inspired is doing in that sentence. It's not unusual for games to draw inspiration from the more clandestine aspects of World War II. Games have used such themes as part of their plots and mechanics, from tactical games such as the Commando series to more action-focused ones such as Call of Duty, but it's unusual to see the SOE name dropped, let alone a specific agent. But while Velvet Assassin claims to be inspired by it, it's important to note that it is not based upon Szabo's story. As such, the connections are limited. Szabo isn't even the main character. Violet Summer takes the role of the player character, and her story features many marked differences from Szabo's. While in some ways this is disappointing, in others it makes sense as a decision. Velvet Assassin takes the form of an admittedly quite weak stealth game. Stealth mechanics are difficult to do well for several reasons. There's a lot of information the player needs in order to properly feel like they're in control of a situation. How visible they are, how much noise they're making, where enemies are looking, all of these need to be conveyed in ways that make it clear to the player without the availability of that information feeling too contrived. At the same time, stealth often necessitates a lot of waiting around for enemy patrol routes, and finding a way to make that engaging for the player, or minimising the time spent waiting, is important to keep the game flowing nicely. This can be especially problematic if the player has to replay large sections of the game after a failure. Unfortunately, Velvet Assassin doesn't solve any of these problems particularly well. There's little to convey from how far you can be heard with any given movement speed, and while visibility is better conveyed, it's a binary system. You're either visible or hidden, and you can't always reliably tell whether an area will hide you or not without standing in it. This is made worse by the enemy's huge visual range. If there's a limit to how far away an enemy can see you, I never worked out what it was, and there's no in-between alert state where you can quickly hide again. Once an enemy spots you, they instantly enter combat mode and start attacking you. It's not even easy to tell whether an enemy knows where you are or has lost you and is searching, since a glitch seems to have enemies always facing where you currently are, regardless of if they're investigating your last known position or coming directly to attack you. The checkpointing could be a lot worse, but it's still usually an encounter further than you might like it to be. This is exacerbated by the dialogue. The Nazis seem to be big fans of having quite long conversations before beginning their standard patrols, and in some cases this can lead you to having to wait for them to finish to have a good chance of making it past them unnoticed, several times if you need to repeat the section. There aren't a great many tools to help you make it past enemies undetected either. Most are for use if your stealth fails, guns for taking out enemies, or a morphine shot that freezes time, allowing you to either run away or take out one enemy. There's a sense that the game doesn't expect you to properly ghost your way through missions either. Zones usually only have a limited number of enemies, and although your ammo and health reserves are severely limited, you can usually shoot your way out of at least a couple of encounters per mission. And the game certainly seems to expect you to be silently killing anyone you come across anyway, with the way enemies are positioned blocking you from proceeding without their demise. The body count you rack up throughout the game is one of the most obvious departures from Szabo's story. While SOE agents faced a full suite of military and paramilitary training, with the men and women facing the same trials and expected to perform to the same standard, that doesn't mean their missions were always focused on direct violence. While sabotage and subversion played an important part in their mission, preparation, information gathering, and propaganda missions were just as vital as direct confrontations. Szabo was to be utilised as a courier for the Salesman Circuit, a network operating in northern France. Before she was deployed, however, word was received that several members of the group had been arrested. Instead, Szabo, alongside fellow agent Philippe Liwa, who originally helped establish Salesman Circuit, were tasked with establishing how much damage had been done and whether recovery of the network was viable. Liwa had originally helped establish the circuit, making his knowledge invaluable, but he was a wanted man throughout the area, so while he had to lay low and provide advice, Szabo was required to perform most of the legwork, establishing how much of the group had been compromised. Ultimately, it was established that the damage was beyond recovery, and the two successfully extracted. It's kind of a shame the developers didn't take more inspiration from her actual assignments. It's not surprising they didn't. A more straightforward action stealth game is seemingly a much smaller risk, especially at the time, but a game about investigating how compromised an underground network is without raising suspicion does sound like it would be quite engaging. On her second deployment, she was to act as courier for a new network, Salesman 2, who were to aid and organise local resistance and Marquis groups in the wake of the D-Day landings. Her capture was only a few days after she arrived in France. There's some question over Szabo's motivation for joining the SOE. Her husband had been killed in North Africa earlier in the war. A soldier in the French Foreign Legion, the two had married after having known each other for just 5 weeks. Before his death, they only got to spend a few weeks of married life together between his deployments. In fact, he never got to meet his daughter at all. It's certainly possible, probable in fact, that Szabo's desire for revenge drove her, at least in part. People close to her reported that she had outright said she wanted to kill Germans. In the end, though, while her actions were certainly valuable to the war effort, she isn't likely to have killed more than one by her own hand. A soldier reported dead during the shootout before her capture, though the truth of reports of the event remain questionable to this day. It's not uncommon for games to exaggerate the number of kills an individual might be expected to engage in. It's pretty much standard at this point that games will massively exaggerate the kill counts of individuals during wars. Whether they're the over-the-top action-focused blockbusters like Call of Duty, or the slower and supposedly more serious so-called military sims, such as the Arma series. But by connecting itself to a real person, who themselves performed a primarily non-combat role, Velvet Assassin really emphasises this divergence. If Szabo did join the SOE from a desire to kill Germans, Summer wants to drown the world in their blood. The game has a preoccupation with the violence and brutality of the war that stains most aspects of its presentation. Amidst footage of burning buildings and corpses, Summer introduces herself thusly, quote, "I longed to be back in the war. That was my true home. We were inhuman beings, butchers on a field full of corpses, corrupt and depraved, only a sum of viscera, blood and bone, creatures without souls." End quote. This presentation naturally doesn't lend itself well to the quieter but no less vital work of information gathering and network building that made up much of the SOE's remit during the war, so missions tend much more towards the sabotage and assassination end of the spectrum. Blowing up fuel depots, killing officers, even hunting down and killing fellow operatives who have been compromised. The closest thing to a non-violent information-gathering mission is one to steal documents detailing the positions and routes of U-boats from the shipyards at Hamburg, though, on your way out, you're also expected to detonate some fuel tanks in order to mark the submarine pens for bombers on their way to participate in Operation Gomorrah. The firebombing of Hamburg by British and American forces claimed tens of thousands of lives and destroyed almost 2/3 of the city's housing. Summer's missions will take her across a variety of locations, from the catacombs beneath Notre Dame to the ghettos of Warsaw and many points in between, but wherever she is, she'll be murdering countless Germans. Most commonly with a knife to the throat, chest, back, or frankly anywhere. She's not fussy when it comes to knifing Nazis, and the game features a wide variety of actually pretty brutal stealth kills, all presented through a red mist. As you approach enemies from behind, the screen begins to turn red. It's a surprisingly effective method of building tension in an otherwise clunky and slightly unresponsive set of mechanics. It's also an excellent example of the more stylized aspects of the game's presentation. There are elements of this stylization throughout. The environments are bathed in colours and contrast, light sources blow out the highlights while deep shadows conceal the player. This is most notable in the opening level. The canyons leading up to the fuel depot are bathed in a warm orange, while red and white flowers speckle the areas of the environment. Unfortunately, for every orange, green or blue environment, there's another area that opts for a more traditional brown or grey aesthetic, which were very popular at the time. The high contrast does work well for most areas, but it does feel a little strange during the daytime sections of Paris or Warsaw, when you can apparently be hidden by the shadow of a truck despite it being broad daylight out. Though, similarly at night, enemies can spot you as easily by moonlight as they can in the day, which all adds to the unsatisfying feeling of the stealth mechanics. Enemies are subtly pale, giving them a more monstrous appearance. Meanwhile, the heavy bloom on the highlights and volumetric fog gives everything a slightly dreamlike quality. This is most apparent during the use of the aforementioned morphine ability. When the world freezes, it's covered in a heavy, blindingly bright fog, the screen blurs slightly and petals float lazily in the air. The reason for this dreamlike appearance is because it is a dream. Most of the story is told retrospectively. Summer has been injured and is comatose in an unknown hospital, remembering the events of her previous missions, but this does little more than to justify the inclusion and aesthetic of the morphine ability. Missions are still told chronologically and have little to do with one another narratively, so there's no reason that the story couldn't have played out in a more traditional linear fashion without the framing device. It's used at times for other purposes, but it's either too ineffective or too infrequent to really have a positive impact on the presentation. Periodically, Summer will resurface from her coma to hear people in the room with her discussing what's to be done about the wanted operative lying comatose in the hospital, whether to hide her or hand her over to the Germans, but this never really amounts to anything. Other times you'll see visions of masked troops and burning buildings, but these aren't so much flashbacks as they are flash-forwards to the end of the game. If the intent is that the entire game takes place in some form of purgatory, then it's neither effectively conveyed or narratively impactful. The biggest disappointment, however, is the one moment that actually makes good use of it. While hunting through a prison near the Warsaw Ghetto in order to sneak a captured operative a cyanide pill, you come across a nondescript hallway. At the end of it you find several nooses hanging from the ceiling. As you approach, the scene changes. The lights turn red, the walls cover with blood, and corpses appear, both hung and left laying on the ground. Then before you can fully take in the scene, it returns to normal. It's a sudden and shocking moment, and the only one like it in the entire game. The coma setup could have opened the entire game to these kinds of moments, meanwhile justifying further exaggeration of the game's visual style. Unfortunately, it does just happen once. I really wish the developers had played with the possibilities granted by the setup in this way more, as they could have elevated the game in a lot of ways. I say that's the most disappointing aspect of the framing device. Actually, it might be the nightie. In her hospital bed, Summer is wearing a nightie that even these days would be considered lingerie, let alone in the mid-40s. She's seen wearing it during the scenes in the hospital and sometimes during loading screens, but she also wears it during gameplay, both during the final few missions after she reawakens and during the use of morphine. This sexualization, alongside her characterization as an emotionally empty, bloodthirsty killer, are all good reasons to identify her as Summer and not Szabo. It's honestly a mercy that the game is inspired and not based on her story given the presentation. Including these elements while trying to claim a closer connection to a real-life figure would have been devastatingly stupid, but it can just about get away with it as disconnected as it is from reality. The sexualization is not exclusive to the nightie, mind you. Summer's clothing options throughout are decidedly form-fitting in ways that are both inaccurate and impractical, all of which is topped off with red lipstick and excessive eyeshadow. Every outfit she wears, whether her own or an acquisition, features a narrow fitted waist and an ample posterior, which is often exaggerated by the Fresnel shading used to indicate that she's in shadow, though thankfully the camera is decidedly understated in its attention to her form. This kind of sexualization is, if anything, more insidious than the more overt nighty. It's not a unique problem, not even one I'm innocent of. Every time I can make my own character in a game, they always fall somewhere on the spectrum of hot woman who is much cooler than me. But it's worth being aware of and pointing it out. The constant insistence that every woman in art or media be in some way physically attractive gives a sense that it's an important element of a woman's worth. I've read a fair amount about Szabo during the writing of this video, and I'm yet to find many sources that don't in some way reference her physical attractiveness amongst her other actual achievements. The presentation of Summer in this regard isn't as bad as many of its contemporaries. It's more an element of broader cultural and subcultural trends, but there were many moments when playing that I was actually glad the developers had distanced her from her inspiration, because it certainly would have been uncomfortable had it been intended to be a real historical figure and not just a vague allusion to one. It's strange to have the sense that in this game about sneakily murdering countless Germans, I'm in some way supposed to be enjoying staring at my avatar's arse, whether that's clad in the tightest trousers the SOE have ever issued, or the latest in mid-century Hugo Boss. The sections where you disguise yourself as a Nazi are a nice change of pace, right up until you realise how much worse they are mechanically. All of the issues of the regular stealth sections are present, but now you are expected to wander around without clear cover, and only a bar on your screen to vaguely tell you whether you're close enough to an enemy for them to sniff you out as an imposter. On top of this, you move slower and make more noise due to the annoyingly clompy heels on the uniform. They're mercifully infrequent, but I'll admit there were more than a few that I just shot my way through instead to save from having to do them properly, and would switch back to the regular gear as soon as possible. That said, it's still a toss-up whether the disguised segments are worse than the final sequence. The final two missions are set as Summer wakes up from her coma, or not if you subscribe to the Purgatory interpretation, shortly before the Germans raid the hospital in search of her. Armed only with a knife and scantily clad in her nightie, the derelict hospital is an absolute nightmare of tricky stealth encounters with no tools to help you out, no guns, and since she's no longer in a coma, no morphine either, so hopefully you didn't spend too many of the skill points you gain for finding optional collectibles on improving that. You gradually make your way through the intended path of each encounter, having to clear a few too many before a checkpoint, and it only gets worse once you exit the hospital. The later areas of the mission are set in the hospital grounds, where the long sight lines, hazy graphics, and unclear enemy view range makes it very easy to be spotted and engaged by enemies you can't even see. And if you can make it through all that, it ends on the same mistake I've seen so many stealth-focused titles make. A lot of time has been spent complaining about forced stealth segments in action games over the years, but they're rarely as painful as action segments in stealth games, and granting you an assault rifle and plenty of ammo just before the final mission gives away that it's going to be a painful ending. A decidedly grim one too. The Nazis are specifically looking for Summer in the wake of her previous mission to assassinate an officer. It's one of the better missions in the game, actually, set around a quiet tavern in the country, winding your way through the compact environment to find a vantage point, then fighting your way back out is very engaging. Completing the mission also earns Summer the bullet in the back that lays her out in hospital. As reprisal for that mission, the Nazis not only raid the hospital she is in, but also assault the nearby village. The fight through the village is grim in more ways than one. Mechanically, it's more focused on combat, culminating in a frustrating firefight outside the church, first fighting the German forces already there, then fending off a counterattack. It feels like this segment killed me more times than the rest of the game combined. The burning wreckage of the village, the screams in the distance, it's an apocalyptic and dire setting. You don't manage to save anyone. Despite fending off the German forces, you're too late, and the church burns with the villagers inside while Summer collapses from exhaustion. The credits reveal that she escapes France in a stolen plane, and also that the officer you assassinated survived, each leaving the option open for a sequel that would never come. The game's poor commercial sales would lead to Replay Studios shutting down the same year as it released. The most grim aspect of the final mission, however, is that like Operation Gomorrah in Hamburg, it's based on a real event. On the night of June 9th, 1944, Helmut Kampf, commander of the 3rd Battalion of the 4th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment, was captured by the local Marquis forces and subsequently executed. The following day, the 2nd SS Panzer Division began a search for Kampf throughout the area, but his close friend, Adolf Diekmann, commander of the 1st Battalion of the 4th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment, ordered his men to the village of Oradour-sur-Glane instead. There, his battalion rounded up everyone in the village, even those simply passing through. The men were marched to nearby barns and sheds, where they would be shot in the legs, doused with fuel, and the building set aflame. The women and children were marched into the village church, where the doors were locked and the building set on fire. Machine guns would cover the windows, shooting anyone who tried to escape through them. In total, 642 people were murdered that day. There were only 6 survivors. As part of the wider search for Kampf, the 2nd SS Panzer Division would set up roadblocks throughout the area. It was one of those roadblocks that Violette Szabo encountered that led to her capture. Ultimately, Summer and Szabo share few similarities. Same first name, same hair colour, same profession in a manner of speaking, but otherwise the two are clearly separate, even beyond one of them being fictional. Summer is a deliberate exaggeration, edgy and nihilistic in a manner that fits the dark and oppressive atmosphere of the game that it's trying to convey. She's larger than life and feels less real for it, but in a way so is Szabo's presentation at times. Several biographies of her exist, but one of the best known is 1956's Carve Her Name with Pride, which in 1958 would be adapted to a film of the same name. Her depiction in these is heroic, effortlessly proficient, facing everything with a stiff upper lip proper for a British citizen, but it's an exaggeration also. Less hagiographic accounts of her life paint a more ordinary picture. Szabo was an ordinary person, just like anyone else. She was competent, but not dramatically so. In fact, reports from her training camp show some question as to whether she would have been suitable as an agent at all. The actions she performed in life are not lessened by this fact, however. Quite the contrary. It is the very fact that she was just a regular person that makes the actions she took, the decisions she made to put herself in such a dangerous position to aid the war effort alongside so many other SOE agents and members of the resistance, so heroic. But the other side of the coin is also true. Adolf Diekmann was also just a regular person, as were each of his men in his battalion. Their actions are all the more horrific for that fact. The choices each of us make, the circumstances each of us find ourselves in, could ultimately lead to either outcome. It's important we don't deify heroes like Szabo, lest we forget that we too are capable of such actions. But it's equally important we don't demonise monsters like Diekmann, lest we forget we could be capable of such actions too if we aren't vigilant against them. Even while drawing inspiration from real life, games like Velvet Assassin will never be as affecting, whether through inspiration or horror, as the stories of the real world, but they don't necessarily have to be. I've learned a lot about Szabo, the SOE, and the war crimes of the SS 2nd Panzer Division, which began long before Oradour-sur-Glane, during the development of this project. True, I did not learn them from Velvet Assassin, but I wouldn't have learned them without it. It's not uncommon for games to use World War II as a setting, but it's far less common for it to draw from specific people or less well-known events. While doing so explicitly would naturally be a better way of introducing these things to people otherwise unfamiliar with them, we still face a culture that often sees games as toys for children, and balks at the idea of trying to tackle anything overly serious, seeing it as being disrespectful. Short of that though, this middle ground of using real-world events and people as inspiration, leaving it open for the audience to investigate it themselves, should they be interested, isn't a terrible first step. Velvet Assassin isn't a great game by any metric, but despite its clunky mechanics and lack of polish, I certainly don't regret playing it, and by introducing me to lesser known parts of history that I wasn't familiar with, I'm certainly better for having played it. I'd love to see other games in future do something similar, or even more explicitly base themselves upon real people and events, even if, like Velvet Assassin, they end up janky as all hell. Thanks for watching.
Huh?